Welcome back. This is week 3, lecture 2, Louis XIV, French Absolutism, and the Divine Right of Kings. And this lecture follows on very naturally the previous lecture, and I will consider it a great success of mine if I can make it through this lecture in less than 5 parts. I will certainly do my best to do so. But in the previous lecture, all 5 parts, we talked about English absolutism. And I believe I said there that, especially with Hobbes, we see English absolutism, even though it culminates in almost a divine right position, it does so from a bottoms up logic and argument, whereas Hobbes starts with the state of nature, individual sovereignty, and then argues up to the absolute sovereignty of the state. French absolutism takes the opposite approach and basically starts with God and goes from God to the king and then down from there. And so it's kind of a top-down absolutism rather than a bottom-up absolutism. At the end of this lecture, the last slide of this lecture, then I'll even problematize the very concept of absolutism as a political theory, because what distinguishes early modern absolutism, especially in the French version of it, from medieval absolutism. And scholars don't really talk about medieval absolutism. A little bit about papal absolutism. I refer to papal absolutism, certainly. But I'm not the only one who really does, who certainly talk about papal monarchy. But it's not really a concept. Whereas all of a sudden in the 17th century, there emerges this concept of the absolute state and absolutism. Now, also, I've talked about the shift from medieval view of the myth of Christendom to the early modern view of the myth of the nation state, and how that was this transition where then the state became the overarching myth for understanding reality. That I think is still valid, but we need to kind of see some of the nuances there because, as we'll see, especially with Louis XIII and then Louis XIV, the individual monarch still sees himself as the ruler. That is his state. Louis XIV comes out explicitly and says, I am the state. So while the distinction should be made, it must be made, I would argue, for this transition from medieval forms of ideological structures to early modern forms of ideological structures. It cannot simply be that the state, abstractly, is something that is new and the monarch then is no longer as important. The concept is difficult to really get at. And to see how early modern absolutism differs from medieval absolutism also is problematic because we can't say that it's, there weren't claims to absolute rule in the Middle Ages, because there were. Um, Certainly, and I'll be talking again about some of those to set the stage, so to speak. But what makes it different? Is it the theory itself, or is it how the theory is put to use? And that is something I want you to think about as we go through today's lecture and as you're looking towards writing your exam, and then finally your final exam, because this will come back on the final exam as well, which is comprehensive. So, that being said, I think then we'll just get right into it and go from there. Textbook readings for this week have been posted. And so it's designed that you are reading the textbook along with the lectures, certainly. That 50-50 kind of division of lectures and textbook. And the readings for this week, the Petition of Rights, which went along with the first lecture of this week, and English absolutism, and then Cardinal Richelieu's Testament for this week in this lecture. And I'll be talking about Richelieu's Testament. And if you have looked forward a little bit to the first midterm, you'll see that part 1 of midterm 1 focuses on that text, Richelieu's Testament. So I'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail, looking towards the midterm as well. So that's kind of the structure. But to get started and try to understand French absolutism as it develops, we're going to return to the medieval view of the ruler, however that is defined, as God's anointed. And if you remember back to the lectures on um, Christendom in the medieval period, which I tried to do all in one lecture, I think, or so, one or two lectures, is really based on this concept of the powers that be. And both the emperor and the pope ended up claiming to be ruling for God. And that is what caused a lot of the conflict going back and forth. And I think I mentioned that earlier on, the emperor viewed himself and referred to himself as the vicar of God. But then, starting in the 13th century, especially with Pope Innocent III, Innocent started to refer to himself consistently as the vicar of Christ and ruling on earth for Christ. And the emperor kind of stopped referring to himself as the vicar of God in that light and started referring to himself as the vicar of justice. But yet there were borrowings back and forth. The emperor would adopt papal imagery and symbolism, and the pope would adopt imperial imagery and symbolism, and it got to be a real mess. And because you had heads of both heads, so to speak, because I can't say heads of state because there were not necessarily a thing as a state at this time, but both monarchs claiming to be the absolute ruler of Christendom. Now, the claim to absolute ruler did not come about because both the emperor and the pope knew that the only absolute ruler was God. God, and then Christ as part of God. So both are appealing to God as the absolute ruler, and both are looking at themselves as the vicar of that absolute rule. In the 17th century, we start seeing explicit claims to the absolute rule of monarchs. In the medieval view, there was certainly this concept of the divine right of kings. Kingship was seen as holy, and there was even myths attached to it about the divine power of monarchs, the scrofula, the divine touch, that the king could actually heal people, and so were ideas that were put out there. So there was this very elevated view that so often is passed over by scholars focusing on the 17th century and absolutism in that context. Why? My view, and this is more my sense, more than something that I've studied thoroughly, is that scholars who study 17th century absolutism are very much study what they like and what they feel akin to. And so they see absolutism part of this age of reason, and that faith goes by the wayside. And that this real opposition of faith and reason, which to me, I would argue, is a very false dichotomy. And I'll be talking more about that in the next lecture, as I think I may have already referred to it previously. But they make it so strong that any kind of religious belief is seen as being distinct from and incompatible with reason, and that absolutism then developed as a political theory of reason. Well, we will see today, at least with French absolutism, that was absolutely not the case. And so it becomes very problematic because in the medieval political theory, which is very different from the political practice, just because the popes and the emperors claimed these very elevated positions ruling directly for God, the reality was something that was more of a compromise and based on practical politics. And so it's those aspects. And it's only when people take the papal claims as being indicative of the reality that we have problems and misunderstanding, which is very, very prevalent. Middle Ages, the age of faith, everybody just listened to the Pope. The popes would have loved if that would have been the case. It would have made their lives much easier. But, ask Henry IV, who's in conflict with Gregory VII. Ask Louis of Bavaria, who's in conflict with John the 22nd, or Philip IV of France, who's in conflict with Boniface VIII, who are capturing these popes and everything else. It's this conflict between, again, secular power or lay power, and ecclesiastical or spiritual power. There was never a conflict of church and state. There was definitely a conflict of who ruled this church state entity, or was it a state church entity? That was the kind of struggle that was going on within Christendom in the Middle Ages from at least approximately the year 1000 on, and on through the 16th century and on into the 17th century. That was the conflict. Now, the powers that be were ordained of God. That was very much the idea. And then it is like, how do we put into practice the power and the absolute power of God's rule, since we are both, Pope and Emperor, that is, the anointed of God? Now, here I had medieval political theory, and we can understand most of medieval political theory in these terms. I've been talking about the imperial side or the princely side, the lay side or the secular power side, meaning those who are not ordained, and then the ecclesiastical spiritual side of things. And we really do see assertions of imperial and papal absolutism, even if not explicitly in name. The Pope would claim, I could be wrong on this, and this is something I should know because I do, this is my area and what I know, but that I don't believe I've seen in papal theory someone claim that the Pope is an absolute ruler, because that implied too that the Pope ruled directly everything. The most extreme papal hierarchic theoretical position was that the emperor served at the pleasure of the pope, so to speak. But yet there were realms that the emperor was to govern himself, and the pope, admittedly, don't have business there. Now, on the imperial side, in some ways that was the case too. It's more of a delegation to say the clergy has their function, fine, and we know that eternal salvation is at stake in what we're doing. But in this world, we are responsible for governing. Now, when we get into French absolutism especially, this absolute rule was more an issue of I am the absolute ruler of all aspects of society. So there is that distinction. And we'll see that when we get there. And we'll see that too when the major advisors, both of Louis XIII and then of Louis XIV, were cardinals. Now, in order to understand the emergence of French absolutism, after we've gone through this kind of the medieval absolutism positions, we then need to follow up on what I've talked about in terms of the crumbling of Christendom and the break up of the concept of Christendom with the Peace of Westphalia, and then the French Wars of Religion, because those were important for understanding what was to come. I think I mentioned when I was talking about the French Wars of Religion between the Catholic League, or the Guise, led by the Guise, and then the Huguenots, or the French Calvinists, which included Princes of the Blood. We have this kind of back and forth with very vicious feelings and very strong feelings on both sides. Henry IV comes to the throne after the assassination of Henry III, who was seen as, kind of a weakling. He was seen as effeminate. He had not produced an heir. I don't even think he was married. And so we have the War of the Three Henrys between Henry, Duke of Guise, Henry Valois, which is Henry III, and then Henry of Navarre, or Henry Bourbon, who then becomes heir to the throne. He was also the leader of the Huguenots. I talked about that whole development in the previous lectures. So Henry assumes the throne as a Huguenot, goes into Paris, conquers Paris, and then converts as a gift to the state. to the people. And in 1598 issues the Edict of Nantes, granting Huguenots, rights of worship just outside Paris, not in Paris, anywhere but Paris, but there are particular areas where they could freely and openly worship and proselytize, meaning try to convert people. Because he had been most of his life, not first of all, a leader as a Prince of the Blood of the Huguenots, and then the leader of the Huguenots after the St. Bartholomew's Days massacre, and then he assumes the throne as a Huguenot, as a French Calvinist, and then on his own terms converts, seen as a great event. And this Edict of Nantes was, in some ways, again a compromise, a little bit like the Peace of Augsburg, not completely, but it did recognize that there could be two religious confessions within France, and there were two recognized religious confessions within France, as long as as the Huguenots, the Calvinists, stayed within their designated territories and didn't come near Paris. Now, as you can kind of imagine, on the one hand, Henry was a national hero, and he still is a national hero in France today. He was a real man's man, which I'm not saying that is the thing to be, but whereas Henry III wasn't going to have any offspring, Henry IV not only produced offspring but also had numerous mistresses on the side. He was and he was a great warrior, a complete stud, if I can use that term, if that means anything still. He really, really was. And he ruled very strongly, and he was seen as this great king, and he still is seen as this great king, one of the great kings of France. But his religious background, and even the Edict of Nantes, was seen as problematic because it didn't side with the Catholics or with the Protestants in some ways, the Calvinists. They kind of said they're both okay. And if you are a convinced Catholic, if you're a member of the Guise family in the Catholic League, you feel that Henry is selling out France because this whole concept of one law, one king, one faith, he's undermined that, and that is treasonous. If you're Protestant, you feel the same way, because the Huguenots still had this ideal of one law, one king, one faith. They were very happy for the Edict of Nantes, but let's say the hardcore radical Calvinists in France felt that Henry had sold them out. So there's also animosity. Even though he's held up as a national history, there's animosity. There were, I think, the count is, 12 assassination attempts on his life. And one was finally successful in 1610 by a Catholic faction member who stabbed him to death in 1610. Whereupon, his young son, then was heir to the throne of France. And his young son was named Louis. Louis's mother was Marie de Medici, Henry IV's second wife. And Louis was only, just going to look here because I wrote it down here. Louis was only 9 years old when his father was assassinated. So he's just a kid. And his mother actually rules as regent until Louis reaches his maturity, or his majority, as it's called, which he does in 1617, when he's 16 years old. He proclaims that he's ruling for himself. But the dilemma he faced, as did Marie, the Queen Mother, the regent, was how to handle these tensions and divisions between the Huguenot factions, or the Calvinist faction, and then the Catholic faction, when they just had come out of a long series of civil war. Civil war is not a good thing, and it tears a country apart. So how do we balance this and hold things together? And this idea of the way to do so is to bring both sides into control and obedience under the authority of the king. And it's this dilemma facing Louis, and first Marie and then Louis, that really is the origins of French absolutism. And in 1624, a newly appointed cardinal, recently appointed cardinal, Cardinal Richelieu, was appointed as the royal chief minister. The royal chief minister. So even though he's a cardinal, he was appointed as bishop previously. He was appointed a bishop in 1607. He was made then foreign secretary for the state of France in 1616. So he had a lot of political experience. Then he was made cardinal in 1622, and then appointed as the chief minister of Louis in 1624. And what does he do? He writes Louis a letter, basically, is what it is. It is a treatise. It's called his Testament. And that is the assigned reading for today. Well, not for today, but for this week, for this lecture. Essentially, Cardinal Richelieu's Testament is a mirror for princes. Now, the genre of a mirror for princes really goes back to medieval times. And the most widely spread one, I believe I mentioned, and if I didn't, I should have, was that written by Giles of Rome, or Aegidius Romanus in his Latin name, around the year 1280, probably by the year 1280. And he wrote it for the future Philip IV, King of France. Philip IV's father, Philip III, asked Brother Giles to write a treatise on rulership, on kingship, for his son, who would be king, and like what's involved with being a king. That treatise was very widespread. It became very widely known. Now, Giles also wrote one of the most foundational documents of the papal hierocratic theory on his De Ecclesiastica Potestate, on ecclesiastical power. So Giles wrote both. But this mirror for prince, the idea was you write this treatise for the prince to read to say, this is how I should rule. So if a prince should do this, 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 and this, am I doing that? It's basically saying, here is a mirror for how you should rule. Now, I could talk a lot about that mirror image and things, but in some ways, this testament, as you will read if you haven't read it already, is very much like that. And if you haven't read it yet, when you get there, you will see that he starts out, Cardinal Richelieu, by addressing Louis. Because he says here in the Political Testament, and I'm quoting from it, but you will read it when you're there. At the time when your majesty admitted me to your councils and confided to me the direction of public affairs, I may say with truth that the Huguenots divided the state with your majesty. The great families behaved as though they had no sovereign, and the governor of provinces as if they had been sovereigns themselves. Every man took his own audacity to be the measure of his merit, so that the most presumptuous were considered the wisest, and proved often the most fortunate. Abroad, the friendship of France was despised. At home, private interests were preferred to the general advantage. The dignity of the throne had so far declined through the fault of my predecessors in office that it was almost unrecognizable. To have continued to entrust to their hands the helm of the state would have led to irremediable disaster. On the other hand, too swift and too great a change would have been fraught with dangers of its own. In that emergency, the wisest considered that it was hardly possible to pass without shipwreck through the reefs and shoals, and there were many who had foretold my fall even before your majesty had raised me to power. And on it goes. Now, when you are reading this text, part one of your first midterm question that will be asked, pay particular attention to Richelieu's description of the importance of royal power and royal authority. Pay particular attention to how he describes it and the necessity of it. Pay particular attention to his view of the common people. Because basically, he says, common people they're dangerous. They don't really understand much. Pay attention to what he says about the nobility. Because that's where the real problem was. I think I already mentioned in terms of medieval political theory and on into the 16th century political theory in terms of the right to rebel against a tyrant, which is so important for Henry IV. Only princes of the blood could really had a right to rebel. Common people didn't have a right to rebel. They're riffraff. Even as the monarch saw himself and princes saw themselves as responsible for those people, which they did. And even here they did with Cardinal Mazarin, or excuse me, Cardinal Richelieu. And then later, as I'll be talking about, Cardinal Bossuet. The monarch was to protect them. But it's very paternalistic. It's like with children. If you have that concept of the idea of French absolutism being paternalistic and very much as a father over a child and a young child who doesn't know better, what would it be like if, your 7, 8, and 9-year-olds took over the world? Well, if you're Louis the 13th, you did take over the world at age 9, even though you weren't really ready to do so yet. So your mother had to rule everything. But that's the concept that was there in terms of the attitude towards the common people. So keep that in mind, and we'll be talking more about that in the lecture before preparing for the first midterm. Because Richelieu's testament, in some ways, is the best insight we have to the emerging theory of French absolutism. It kind of begins with this dilemma of Louis XIII after the assassination of his father. The tensions between the two are still very much between